Hello, how's it going?
It is going all right. As a matter of fact, literally just as I was calling you, the reminder on my phone popped up that it was time for me to call you. So apparently I am following my schedule perfectly.
Ah, wonderful. We are on time.
Yes, that is all that matters in life. But how about you? How are you doing?
Well, I had a whole weekend where I didn't even have to care about being on time. Uh,
Ooh,
yeah, my
that
wife and
sounds
I,
stressful. I mean, delightful.
uh, right? I know we don't actually know how to live in that space, but yeah, it was my wife's birthday this last weekend. And so we went away for the weekend and we went to this quiet little mountain retreat in this tiny house that sits up in the snowy mountains and the foothills of Mount Hood. And man, we just enjoyed sitting by the fire and playing games and talking and napping. And yeah, it was wonderful. We
Mm.
really enjoyed ourselves. And now we're back to real life where our phone dictates what we have to do next.
Oh man, well, I am glad you got time away. That's incredible.
Yes. So needed. Man, life just gets so busy and you forget to pause and go take those retreats. And when you do, you're like, oh,
Mm.
yeah, we probably should do this more often.
Yeah, I like to think that my wife and I get away by ourselves at least once a year, and then I look at the calendar and realize it's every couple of years.
Ugh,
But life happens so fast that it feels like every year to me. It just isn't.
right. Yeah, which is problematic.
Yeah, life is crazy.
Hmm. Well, what do you have on tap for us today?
Man, well, we have been working our way through this super fun little series, Misquoting Paul, and I want to end on a really complicated text that I am curious to hear what you think about.
Yeah,
Yes.
I'm nervous. I'm
Okay.
nervous.
So this is, again, one of those texts that I feel like gets just thrown out there like a unintended trump card. But everybody else, you'll get the joke in just a minute. Uh, but this is Romans 13, where Paul says this: let every person be subject to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and those authorities that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Do you wish to have no fear of the authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive its approval, for it is God's agent for your good. But if you do what is wrong, you should be afraid, for the authority does not bear the sword in vain. It is the agent of God to execute wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be subject not only because of the wrath, but because of conscience. For the same reason, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are God's agents busy with this very thing. Pay to all what is due them, taxes to whom taxes are due, revenue to whom revenue is due, respect to whom respect is due, honor to whom honor is due. That's
Hmm.
Romans 13, 1 through 7. And I am so curious how you particularly hear this verse, because in the middle of this complex kind of statement about how Christians ought to relate to the government, you actually work for the government.
Yeah, I do. I really do. So this text is super complicated. And to tell you just how complicated, let me just back up. You made a joke a moment ago about the quote trump card and you intended the pun. And I think in doing so, you illustrate one way that this text gets used. And it is specifically in reference to the federal government. And I think that's just my initial starting point, is to think about the federal government, and particularly whoever the president is. And I mean, if we think about the last 4 presidents, we had Barack Obama, Donald Trump, Joe Biden, and then Donald Trump again. And everybody in that, like, that list gives enough for everybody to hate something, right?
Yes, that's so true.
I'm not sure. I think there are people in the United States who would say, I don't love any one of those 3 people. But I am quite sure that among all 3 of those people, there is something for everybody to hate. And that's problematic when we sit down with this text and say we're supposed to be subjected to the governing authorities. And I don't care which of those people you hate, you come down to this text and go, wait, I have to be subjected to that guy? And so that's one tension I feel in this text. But the other tension that I have in this text is that I work for 911. We dispatch police, fire, and medical. In fact, I am, as we record today, wearing a sweatshirt that has emblazoned on it logos from my local police department. And so I have an affinity for the police and for the work that they do. It is a very hard job, and we are intricately connected into that work at 911. And at the same time that that is true, I pick up and I read Esau McCaulley's book, Reading While Black, subtitled African American Biblical Interpretation as an Exercise in Hope. And he writes a lot about Romans 13, particularly from the Black experience, and particularly the ways in which Romans 13 is likely talking a lot about policing and the negative experiences that the Black population has had with policing in America. And I see that, and I acknowledge it, and I have no qualifications around it. I am both pro-police and very cognizant of the ways in which policing has been done poorly in many instances in America. And so I have all of these competing things. So I'm coming at this as a Christian. I'm coming at it as a partisan who likes certain things about the federal government and not other things. I am coming at it as a cog in the system. And when we come to this latter part of the text where it says, hey, you got to pay your taxes and all of that, my paycheck comes from tax dollars. I am 100% tax dollar funded. So I am not a neutral party on any of this. And this makes it a very complicated conversation for me.
Really? That's so interesting. And I think all of that demanding nuance has to come into conflict with the sort of traditional approach to what this text means, right? Like, generally speaking, I think that this text is used by the Christians who support whichever party is currently in power to say, we're supposed to do what the government tells us to do.
Mm-hmm.
And it has become a partisan weapon in the Christian political armory, right? Like, how dare you say that against the government, even though we were doing the exact same thing 4 years ago, because the government is instituted by God. And so whatever they're doing is just, and like the be obedient or subject is like in this text, like 500 times.
Yes. And I think that's, one scholar that I read put it this way, and I think it just really highlights the tension very well. He says, it is not the opaqueness of this passage that is distressed and divided interpreters, but its clarity.
Mm.
It is very clear. Be subject to the governing authorities. Full stop. There it is. No nuance, no, room for wiggle. Like, it's just, there it is. And you go, wait a minute, but what happens when the government isn't doing what the government's supposed to do? Do we get to call out injustice when we see it? Do we get to call sin, sin? Do we get to call evil, evil, even when it comes from our governing authorities? And Paul does not address that here. And that's what's so problematic for me.
Yeah, I totally agree. And having also read Macaulay, though I don't have it in front of me, there are 2 points that I find helpful that Macaulay made. The first, and both of these come back to a point we've talked a lot about in this little series of ours. And the first one is that there is a need to make sure we pay attention to this in broader context, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, and there are 2 elements of biblical context I think are super important here. First, there is a long strand of biblical story in which people take a stand either actively or passively against the government and are considered righteous in doing so. So, for example, there are the Hebrew midwives in Exodus chapter 1 who disobey Pharaoh's command to kill the Hebrew babies.
Yeah.
Then there is Rahab in Joshua, what is that? 3, 4,
2.
2, who protects the spies when the government comes searching for them. And then there's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in Daniel, who refuse to bow to the idol. And there's the apostles in Acts chapter 5, who are told, stop talking about this Jesus guy. And they say, we must obey God rather than human beings. So there's this long theme that stretches straight through Scripture from end to end, that there are times when some kind of civil disobedience is warranted. And I think it's essential, and this is a point Macaulay makes, it is essential that we read this text in the context of that long running strand of teaching.
Yes. And I will say this about this text. This text brings balance to those texts. Those texts are all examples of subversion to the pagan government. And we could add to that list our whole study on the book of Revelation and the way that Revelation exposes this very same Roman government as subservient to the beast. And so if we look at this and say, we're supposed to be subjected to the beast and we're supposed to be acquiescent to the beast, like this feels at tension with that broader narrative. And I think what it does is bring some balance, but balance in what way?
Yes.
I think is the real question.
Yeah, that's exactly it. There are a number of different things, and I would even throw all of the prophets in the Old Testament into this group. And there, you mentioned earlier, a lot of the examples I gave were pagan authorities. Prophets take a stand against both pagan and Jewish authorities. So there's this long strand. And what all of that tells me as I read this text is the simple reading that I want to default to can't be the correct reading. What it doesn't tell me is what is the correct reading.
Well, what's the simple default reading that you're rejecting?
I think that it's very black and white. Whatever the government says, we're supposed to be obedient or submissive to that.
And you'd say you would reject that.
Yes. As the totality of the argument, yes, we can't say just whatever the government says it goes.
I completely agree. And I think that's why I'm so frustrated with this text, is that Paul, for the first time in his life, just abandons all nuance. It's like, Paul, come on. Like you just a couple of chapters ago talked about Pharaoh and Moses and how God overthrew Pharaoh for his unjust rulership. And you go, okay, well, a leader of Israel overthrew a pagan government. And now you're saying we're supposed to all be submissive to the pagan government. Like, what is going on? Why are you not nuancing this? And I think that's why I'm so frustrated with this text. I can put it in the broader biblical witness and bring some nuance, but I'm frustrated that Paul doesn't do that.
Yeah, I totally get it. And two things that help me here. One, you alluded to earlier, and I want you to flesh out because you almost assumed it in your description of your current work. And that is that in many ways, one of the arguments Macaulay makes is that what Paul is really talking about here is what we would call the police rather than something else. Am I remembering that correctly?
No, you're exactly right. He does. Were you asking more than one question, though? Because that's one.
That's one. I'll get to the second one in a moment. I want to land on this point for a second, which is who is the governing authority that we're talking about?
Yeah. So Macaulay argues, and I think successfully, that much of this has to do with the police because he says in verse 4, "For he does not bear the sword in vain." And it's that verbiage of bearing the sword that scholars have seen play out in other texts of the time as a way of referring to the policing aspect of the Roman military. This bearing the sword in context, in the local context of the time, meant the policing by the Roman military. And contextually, that makes sense to what Paul is saying. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. And so, in other words, like, just obey the law, and the law is not coming after you, is kind of the argument there. Because they don't wield the sword in vain, for he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath for the wrongdoer. And I'll tell you this, from my vantage point at 911, I talk to the victims. I talk to the people who need the police to come and intercede and intervene and bring justice to the wrongdoer. That is my daily, repetitive experience of the police. This is a bad situation. There is a bad agent. The police need to go and deal with that bad agent for the protection of the community over and over and over again. That is why I am pro-police, and that is where I agree with Paul. Guys, properly used, this is the police's role. This is the government's role, and we should absolutely fall in line with that. We should do nothing to really break those laws or bring that wrath down upon us. We should be, to use a line from the Old Testament, we should seek the good of the city that we're in. And so that to me is where policing really fits into this text.
Yeah, and I think this is fascinating because if we are to distinguish between the policing agent or agency and the lawmaking agency a little bit here, it would be very easy to dishonor the police because of our opinions about the lawmaking body.
Oh man. I see this all the time in my work. Look, I dispatch in a city context. And one of the things that cities all across the country has to grapple with is how to address the homelessness issue.
Mm-hmm.
If left unaddressed, the homelessness runs rampant in the city and creates livability issues for the rest of the community. If left overly addressed, we've failed to address the issues of addiction and poverty and mental illness that underlie much of the homelessness issue. And so if we over-police the issue and we neglect some of those other things, then I don't think we're necessarily doing a service either. And so the tug of war between support and policing is a constant moving target in the place where I dispatch, in probably every city in the country. And so depending on who is in charge and what the policies are going to be, directly affects the police in how they do their jobs pertaining to that issue among many, many, many others. And so you're exactly right. Sometimes we want to bash the police for their overaction or their underaction for any number of topics. And yet, almost all the time, that is related to the policies of the decision makers far above them.
That, and I would say the other thing, a lot of times we want to bash the police. And if that is a distinction between the police and those who are policymakers, the other is I think we need to make a distinction between the police as an abstraction. That is to say, the police officers in general in my community versus a police officer in my community.
Yeah.
And here's why I say that. I worked in an inner city dealing with the exact same issues you dealt with over and over and over again. I worked in a church where this was our day in and day out experience. And I remember like 10, 15 years ago, somebody overdosed across the street from our church. And it was somebody I knew. And it was somebody who had been trying to clean their lives up, but they overdosed. And the police somehow got and showed up, and they were exceptionally rude and incredibly dismissive to this addict. They did not treat him like a human being. They treated him like a druggie. And it was heartbreaking to me. But a different time, and this was far more recent, let's say 5 years ago, 6 years ago, we had an incident where someone was actually in our church building and they had a significant mental break, and we did not consider them to be safe, and they would not leave, and we had to call the police. And these two officers were brilliant. I mean, I've spent 20 years working with people dealing with addiction and mental health and poverty all in one giant ball of wax. I could not have imagined the police doing a better job of treating the person with dignity and respect while keeping the situation safe for the community. And my point in telling those two stories is just to say, even if we have negative experiences with a police officer, we don't get to spill those over to the police as an institution.
Right.
We have to start with a place of respect. And I think that's one of the things this is saying is you default to respect with police officers and those in authority. That's just where you need to start.
Well, and even more than respect, right? You default to respect to submission. You default to getting with the program. But then it is okay to call out the misbehavior. It is okay to say those officers treated that person struggling with addiction poorly. They disregarded their humanity in the process of trying to execute their jobs. And that is a problem. And to put it in a different context, nobody ever talks about being pro-dispatcher or not pro-dispatcher, right? But if there were categories, I am very pro-dispatcher. I love the staff that I work with. They are phenomenal human beings doing a very hard job, and they do it with a high degree of excellence. But I am also not going to turn a blind eye to the fact that sometimes we are rude, we are snippy, we treat addicts in the same way that you just described from those officers sometimes. We get jaded and we start treating people from a jaded place. And that's not okay. And so At the same time that I can say I absolutely love our staff and think they do a phenomenal job, I can also say, hey guys, we got to clean this up. When you treat people like that, it is a problem, and we're going to address that problem.
And I think one of the reasons I focused on the word respect is that I believe when you demand better behavior of individuals in the institution, you are showing respect for the institution, not disrespect for the institution.
Yeah.
And I think that's important. This comes back to, remember you said, hey, did you have two things? This comes back to my second thing, which is this phrase in verse 3, rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. There is a proper definition of what it means to be a ruler, whether we were talking about legislative rulers or kind of executive rulers like a police officer or something like that, who's executing the law.
Or federal versus local government. Like it's all of it.
Any of these things, the definition of a ruler is a person who is not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. So when people who we know have good conduct and yet experience terror because of those authorities, it's the authority that has slipped out of this text, not the person who calls out the authority.
Yeah, I think many commentators have made that point about this text, that as much as this calls the church, the people of God, to overall posture themselves in submission to the local, the federal, the government entities, it also is a warning to the government entities themselves to say, look, you are instituted by God for a purpose. And when you stop fulfilling that purpose, you are at cross purposes with the God who put you in authority. And that's a dangerous place to be. And so,
yes.
Yeah, it's just as much a warning to them as it is advice to us.
And this is where, let me throw something by you. This is a thought that I just had that maybe this is relevant and maybe it's not. But can you remember a parenting moment where your kids were arguing with one another?
It's never happened.
I certainly can. Never happened. I understand your kids are,
Yeah, they're perfect. You
perfect.
could say it. Yeah, there you go.
My jealousy almost inhibited me. But but one of the challenges I have had, particularly when my kids were younger, is that if they got in a fight and I was separating them and addressing the issue of the fight with both of them, with my daughter, I'm addressing her issues in the moment. And she wants to talk to me about what I ought to be saying to her brother. And when I'm talking to my son, I'm addressing his issues. And he wants me to be talking about what I ought to be saying to her. Does this all make sense so far?
Oh, yeah, yes. And I see where you're going. I love it. Please proceed.
Okay, so I'm going to wonder out loud, because again, this is not a thought I prepared, but I am going to throw out, this is a letter addressed to the church. And so it is giving the church instruction about how to be the church, particularly in a context when the church has no influence on the secular government. This is not a representative democracy. This is an empire. The church does not have any role, responsibility, or moral authority over the government. So this letter is telling the church in that context what they ought to be doing. If Paul were writing a letter to a different audience, that is to say the government, I wonder if he would have said something very, very different.
Oh, that is such a great analogy with the kids, because you're absolutely right. When the kids are fighting, they're like, oh, well, but he did or she did. And you're going, okay, I will address their issues with them. Right now, I need to talk about your role and your responsibility in this matter. And that's the only thing I want you to concern yourself with. And
yes,
that's
exactly.
that's the hard thing about this text, because we come to this and we go, yeah, but what about when the government doesn't do what they're supposed to do? And, but, and you're exactly right. It's the exact same thing. So then what is the takeaway for the church? Is it just pure follow and submit?
Yeah. And this is where I think we have to be honest about the governmental system in which we live. We live in a representative democracy where we have a responsibility for what the government is doing because we as a community elected them. As we record this, President Trump has signed into effect 50% more executive orders than any other president in this century. To beat him out, you have to go back to people like FDR. So we as a community can't say, well, that's just what Trump is doing. We have to say, we elected him. And that, because that's the system we operate in, I think that there is an interesting set of questions about how we ought to have influence on the legislative and executive elements of the government. But I think that those are fundamentally separate from this text. I don't think this text is trying to address those issues. Does that seem accurate to you?
Well, yeah, especially since Paul could not have conceived of the representative democracy that is the United States of America.
Yeah, he may have known classical Greek, Athenian representative democracy. So conceptually, but spreading that concept across a continent in which there are multiple levels of government, local, state, federal, etc. I just don't think that's what he's talking about here. I think we are on far more accurate grounds when we bring this into lines of, if the police try to pull you over, pull over. If the government, if there is a law on the books, respect it as law. Again, with the caveat of unless you think some kind of civil disobedience is necessary. And that, I think, again, the question of civil disobedience may need to be a different topic.
Well, I think it is part and parcel. And I think that because of the way Macaulay interprets this text, I think is really helpful. And especially if you go back to the biblical story arc that you painted earlier about all of this political subterfuge that have played out in the biblical narrative. And you go, okay, well, clearly God's people exist as their own kind of political entity, if you will, not in the same way we mean politics today, but we serve Christ as the ultimate authority. And so this, going back to N.T. Wright's language, if Jesus is Lord, Caesar is not. And we could say, because we follow Jesus, we follow a higher authority than any of our political rulers, state, local, federal, whatever. We could land at a place of saying, well, then let's overthrow the entire system because the system doesn't matter anymore. We follow Jesus. And I think Paul is giving a word of caution to that and saying, guys, look, we're not going to just tear everything down and have utter anarchy. The earthly governing authorities serve a purpose. And like I said, I work for one of those governing authorities. I see the purpose that it plays in society. So there is a helpful role here. And yes, we serve a higher kingdom. We have a higher authority, and we don't have to fall in line with the thinking and the values of our culture. But we do have to play along to get along in a way. We're not here to overthrow everything. I think that's the caution. It's saying, yeah, God is greater, but that doesn't mean overthrow everything, because your judgment isn't what we're going off of here. You don't know the line of where God's going to overthrow everything and put everything back to rights.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and it's fascinating to me thinking about it that way. It's intriguing to me to think about the fact that this is coming on the heels of Paul describing the body of Christ, the church, right, in Romans chapter 12. I just wonder to what degree Paul is exactly making that point. Almost, I wonder if you could go so far as to say Paul is saying, like you said, we're not going to burn everything down. It's not the church's job to replace the government. Let the government do the government's job.
Yeah.
Which
Yes.
I think has profound implications for the church in our cultural context.
It does, without being passive about it. Because I think what you said is absolutely correct. We functionally live in a representative democracy. And so we have a responsibility to influence how the government goes about doing its job. However, the church has its own job to do, and that is far more important. So let's let the church be the church, the government do the government's job. We'll influence that where it needs to be. But at the end of the day, let's follow along with the rules as they are so that we can just go about being the church without being harassed by the government.
Absolutely. Well, and what's fascinating to me, again, as we think about, as I envision, and I would invite you and our listeners to envision, if you could get one snapshot that summarized or symbolized what it meant for Christians to take a stand when the government was not doing its job properly, right? Because we're saying at times that's going to need to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Would that mental picture look like our master being crucified at the hands of the governing authorities? Is that our political approach? You know, I think of this primarily because of some of the reading I've done about Martin Luther King Jr. and his description of civil disobedience and the ways in which Jesus was teaching civil disobedience in the midst of the Sermon on the Mount, when he says things like, if they demand your coat, give them your shirt as well. If they're going to slap you, let them slap you again. And to us, there is something absurd about claiming that that is going to somehow change the system.
Mm. Well, and especially you talked about a couple of the examples, but this whole go the extra mile that we have in our lexicon, right? That literally was a Roman practice. When soldiers didn't want to carry their gear anymore, they could require any citizen to carry their gear for up to a mile. Hey, you, I don't care what you're doing. Stop what you're doing. Carry my gear down the road for a mile. And Jesus is saying, yeah, if they force you to do that for a mile, go with them 2 miles. What? That's government overreach. That's them being tyrannical. And you're saying I should submit to that, and not only submit to it, but go an extra mile and be kind to this guy? That's political nonsense.
Exactly. And yet, Jesus himself and Christian social leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. are suggesting that's the way we bring the kingdom. And what's amazing to me is that is bringing the kingdom by being subject to the governing authority, right? Like that motif on no level disagrees with anything in Romans 13. There is no problem there.
Right.
It's the only thing that is going to be damaged in the crossfire is our rights and our ego.
Right. But it's a very subtle but profound critique of the system at the exact same time. When you say,
absolutely,
I follow Jesus, And because I follow Jesus, I'll go 2 miles.
Mm-hmm.
And your demand, your
Mm.
tyranny, your authority matters not a whit, because I'm willing to serve because I follow Jesus. It's subtle, but man, is it powerful.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to do the right thing. And the right thing is love and self-sacrifice. And I'm going to do it, and I'm not going to make a big deal about it. And I'm not going to seek power or authority because of it. Just going to love and do the right thing. And if it hurts, that's fine. I'm doing it voluntarily.
Mm,
That, I think, is at least a piece of the way people who follow the crucified Messiah are going to engage in the political system.
man, so good. I think you're exactly right. I think you've hit on exactly the right heartbeat for this text. We will forever and a day be wrestling with how to apply and properly interpret this text. But if we do it with that heartbeat, I think we're going to be in a really good place.
Yes, exactly.
Well, this has been a super fun series on misquoting Paul. I'm not sure that this one quite fell into line. I don't think we, explained everything and just said, "Oh, see, this is actually how you interpret it." This one's just too big for that. But man, oh man, it was super fun. I really enjoyed this series. And I want to turn to our audience and say, if you have enjoyed this series as well, I want you to do a huge, huge favor for us. I want you to go to your podcast app or wherever you listen to us and just like and follow. We would really appreciate that. It really helps us out with our statistics and with being able to share this podcast with others and make it known to others. And we would love if you took this series or any episode that you have resonated with and just share it with a friend. Let them know that these are some really fun, engaging conversations, and you'd love for them to participate like you have been. So please share this, like this, comment. It helps us out a ton.
Yeah, absolutely. And we would love to hear your thoughts. Which, speaking of, do we have time this week to actually get some other thoughts?
Nope, sure don't. We talked ourselves silly.
Well, let's get to the way we want to end every episode, which is a rich Josh question. Are you ready?
We want to end every episode this way?
Well, nobody makes us. So clearly we do.
I don't know. I think our former selves wanted to end it this way, and we just have fallen in line. Like, we've forgotten that we can disagree with ourselves.
Maybe. I'll have to reevaluate. But for today, I'm not even sure I know the entire question. So maybe that gives a little too much away. But today's question is, which Josh got a little carried away with 420?
Okay. So what's funny to me is that before we started recording, you admitted that you did not know what 420 meant. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So I recently preached a sermon to a rather older congregation. There's some young families there too, but it is an older congregation that is kind of revitalizing and so bringing in some new families. And while I was preaching to this audience, I thought I was really going out on a limb here, but I was showing how numbers mean things in our culture, because we were looking at a passage in Revelation. Revelation has lots of numbers and symbolism around numbers.
Oh. To make your point, I now know what we're talking about. Okay, continue on.
Okay. Well, so the number 13, right? This is bad luck. The 13th floor on a building, super scary, all these things. The number 7 is super lucky. And then 420. And so I put a slide on the big, on the screen at this congregation that said 420 time. And I had a big old pot leaf on there. And I said, see, numbers mean things, even in our culture. And I had to stop and explain it. I said, look, some of you have no doubt followed Jesus so closely that you have no idea what this means. And for you, I will explain. For the rest of us pagans, we got this one immediately. Because 420 is the symbol for pot smoking. And I was like, I don't know how this is going to go over in this congregation, that I'm like using this as an example of why numbers mean things. And so I got to the church and like I go up to the sound booth to get my microphone, and I asked the guy that's doing slides. He's like a 13-year-old kid. I said, do you have any questions about my slides or anything? You know, and he pulls up that slide. He went straight for it and he just pointed at it like, seriously, you want to put this up there? Does this belong here? And I'm like, oh, no. I'm making a point with that. It's fine. We're going to keep that. And he's like, he looks at me like, okay, dude, it's your funeral. Like, it's just.
That's amazing.
Yes. So
you got a little carried away with 420 in church.
Oh, that would have been a better way to phrase the question. You're right. I did.
Oh, it's all right.
Yeah.
It's okay. We'll pray for you. We won't really. We just say that.
Yeah, right. There's my 420 story for church.
Amazing. All right. Well, we on for next week?
All right. I'm looking forward to it.
All right. I'll talk to them.
All right. Bye.
Bye.